We're going to be back into a lot of historical material, so I trust you can follow along again. We're going to pick up with the Medo-Persian kings where we left off in the last message. I had a lot of specialized classes in this in college. I studied all of these kings and things specifically. That's why I'm fairly familiar with it. But I was doing all that in preparation for what I knew the Lord called me to do. So this is all preparation for you, for however the Lord is going to use you and use it in your life later on. We had whole classes on Cyrus and study the battle plans and things like this. And I remember the first few, that was my first semester freshman in college. That's what I was whenever we started. I remember the first few classes there. I didn't know which way was north or south, because I'd never heard of anything like that. You don't get that back in schooling days in high school, or at least I didn't, and you certainly don't get it in the church. And since you never read your Old Testament, you don't get it from the Bible either. So you can take courage. I must have learned it somehow, or I couldn't be teaching it now. So maybe your first few classes in here, you can't tell which way is east or west when it comes to all of this history, these battles, and these kings. But I find in my life that the longer I stay with something, it just becomes like your telephone number to you.
Amen.
Your telephone number is pretty hard to remember the first day you get it, especially when you move around a lot. You're always changing numbers. But the one number I never have forgotten is the first telephone number I had, and we were raised for 15 years. I never forgot that one. I can't remember any of the other ones that I've had over the years, except that one. I've never forgotten that. You stay with it so long. 398-1008. See, I still remember what it was. We had that area code, someone says. That was 901, area code. But I don't remember any of the other numbers, but it was because I stayed with that for 15 years. And then it doesn't matter what you do the rest of your life. You never have to use it again. You'll never, ever forget it. The same is true with a lot of this. The longer you'll stay with it, the more you'll find that it'll stay with you, and you won't forget it in the future. So it took me a little while in those classes in college, that was back my freshman year, to get all these kings and battles down, particularly some of the ones we're going to get into, some of the naval battles of Marathon and the naval battle of Salamis. That we spent a lot of time dissecting the battle plans of the two respective kings involved in those two battles. And I still remember some of the very questions on the test. One of them was an essay question about describing Marathon. And you knew better than to say a candy bar, but you didn't know much better than that whenever it was your first time in and someone wants you to describe Marathon. Or a long race, you could say a 26-mile race, but I knew it wasn't that. I knew it had something to do with these Greeks and these Persians. So we're on the ladder of those, the Persians. Now we left off, we went through Cyrus, we went through Darius the Mede. By the way, there's a good book out entitled Darius the Mede by John Whitcomb. It's probably the best book on the subject, written I think back in the 50s, the late 1950s or so. I've got the book and read it a long time ago, and it'll give you a lot of the good answers of connecting Darius the Mede with Guburu. Because the well-known Old Testament scholar who has since died, E.J. Young, said that there's no way you could connect Darius the Mede with Guburu. But then, as Whitcomb points out in his book, in a personal letter from E.J. Young to Whitcomb after Young had read the manuscript for Whitcomb's book, Darius the Mede, he said, "I see the light now, how definitely Guburu was the same as Darius the Mede." And what was the problem? What's the problem with Darius the Mede, Guburu? What's the problem there? Darius the Mede's never mentioned anywhere in the whole world outside the book of Daniel. And so we've already got all of these higher critical problems with the book of Daniel being written during the Maccabean era and not back somewhere in the 6th century B.C. So whenever you bring up not only that, but the problems of connecting Darius the Mede with anyone in history, then you've got a serious set of circumstances on your hands. But it can be demonstrated, as Whitcomb does in his book entitled Darius the Mede, that no doubt Darius the Mede was Guburu. So I hope you have your kings and your prophets chart. We're going to be using that a lot again tonight. He's really not in the Achaemenid line of Persian kings. Achaemenid was just an ancient Persian name. Most of these kings are descended in some way from them. Darius Hystaspes, he's a little questionable. He does his best in the Behistun inscription, telling us that he was an Achaemenid, but whether that's true or not, he certainly was one of the great kings of ancient Medo-Persia. But Darius couldn't be. Why? He's Darius the Mede. He wasn't a Persian. But as we showed you, and I think there's a map in his book. If you'll turn back, just to review this real quickly so you won't forget, if you turn back to Daniel chapter 9, well, before that, Daniel chapter 5. Now, I know all this we covered the last message, but it doesn't hurt to quickly look over it. Not everyone remembers all of that or understood what we were talking about then. It's really very, very easy. But like I say, you're not in any position any worse than the one I was in whenever I first heard Darius the Mede or whatever, or Gubaru, or Bardigia, or Smyrtus, or Pseudo-Smyrtus, or Gamata, or any of the rest of them for the first time. And so don't think that, people think because I know this, I was born with all of this knowledge or something. And well, for me, I could never do that. Well, you can do it the same way I did it. Just learn. Study. That's all you have to do. You weren't born knowing Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, but when you go to school, you learn that. And if you stay around it long enough, you'll remember that. We said in Daniel 5, verses 30 to 31, that we've got a problem with Darius the Mede taking the kingdom as a 62-year-old man, 62 years old. That's pretty old to be out fighting, going underneath the walls of Babylon, the dried-up riverbed of Euphrates. Well, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median received the kingdom. How could Darius the Mede be the king of the Medo-Persian Empire when we know from history, as well as from the Bible, that Cyrus was the king? Well, you have to connect that with chapter 9 and verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which means he's Darius the Mede, not Darius the Persian, which was made king. Someone appointed him king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Now, the Chaldean realm was just one part of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so, like I was beginning to say, I believe Whitcomb's book even has a good map showing you the whole Medo-Persian Empire, from Afghanistan all the way over to Lydia, down into Egypt and so forth. We discussed that last week. Then you'll see right in the center of that, it's a darkened out portion that takes up Mesopotamia, the Assyrian, Babylonian realm, the Chaldean realm. And who was made satrap here, or as the Bible says, king here? Well, it was Darius the Mede. But that doesn't mean he was king over the Medo-Persians. We know he wasn't. As you see in your chart, Darius was only an under-lieutenant, we could say, of Cyrus. Okay, then after Cyrus and Darius, we discussed Cambyses. He was the one who lost his 50,000-man army, remember, as he was trying to take Carthage, that was just discovered a year or so ago. And let me just kind of tell the end of the story of Cambyses, so it'll bring us back up to date to where we need to be tonight. Cambyses, after he had taken Memphis, he had sacked Memphis, destroyed a lot of the Egyptians there, made the Egyptians quite angry with him, but after he had taken control of Memphis, which was equal to taking control of Egypt, then he wanted to go over to Carthage, which was the famous power that fought Rome in the Punic Wars in the several centuries prior to Christ. And on the way there, of course, as we told you last week, a blinding sandstorm overcame this 50,000-man army, overcame them to the point they were never seen of or heard again until just last year. After that, since he was unsuccessful in going and either looking at or taking Carthage, sending that many men, he probably wanted to do more than just look at the city, probably wanted to take the city, decided to go south into Cush. And he tried to do that, and he didn't get very far until... This is where we ended last week, until he heard news from back in Media that someone had taken over the throne in his absence. And who was that? Well, you look on your chart there, and his name really was Gamata, G-A-U-M-A-T-A, Gamata. Gamata, while Cambyses was away in Egypt, took the throne in Persia. But he took the throne not under his name, Gamata, but he took it under the name of the dead son of Cyrus, brother of Cambyses, Bardigia. Remember, whenever Cyrus went eastward to fortify the border over near Afghanistan. It was a Persian law that you had to leave someone on the throne in case you didn't return. And it was good that Cyrus did, because in fact he did not return. Who did he leave on the throne? He left his son Cambyses on the throne. But after he was killed, we're speaking of Cyrus now, over toward the Afghanistan border, after he was killed, then there was a little warfare between two of his sons, one of them by the name of Bardidya, and another one by the name of Cambyses. And Cambyses ended up killing his own brother, Bardidya, because Cambyses was in the true line of succession to be the king over the Medes and the Persians. And all of that figures in, because look at the name in parentheses of this individual, Bardidya. Well, he couldn't take over the throne as Gamata, but he would just assume, because Gamata obviously was in the Achaemenid line of Persian kings. But Bardidya was, but Bardidya's dead. But that's a good name to take because it's a proper name, at least you're a son of Cyrus. And the Greeks knew him by his name Smerdis, and so that's what we refer to him as. However, really your chart's a misnomer here because this isn't Smerdis. He's better known as pseudo-Smerdis, so you might want to write that in on the chart. He was one who posed to be Smerdis. He wasn't Smerdis. Smerdis had been killed years before by his older brother Cambyses. So Smerdis really should be pseudo-Smerdis. And he went by his Persian name Bardidya, that is the name of Cambyses' brother, but his real name was Gamata. Now Gamata, or we're going to refer to him as pseudo-Smerdis. That's generally what he's referred to. Pseudo-Smerdis only reigned 2 months. He wasn't a very good ruler. And then a combination of 7 Persian families staged a revolt against pseudo-Smerdis. And the man who was next to become king, which happened to be part of one of these 7 families, his family was the 6th of the 7 families who rose up against pseudo-Smerdis, was actually the one who executed Smerdis and took over the kingdom. And that brings us to that king, the 5th one that we've been discussing. We looked at Cyrus, then Darius the Mede, Cambyses, pseudo-Smerdis. And now we get to another important one, and another one that's going to interact with Israel's history and the biblical narrative. And that's Darius the First Hystaspes, or he's also called Darius the Great. As you'll see, there were several in the line of Darius. The same is true with Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, whenever we get to him. You've got a Darius the First, Second, and so forth, all the way down to the 3rd that I can remember, at least 3 people that go by the name Darius. Not counting Darius the Mede now. Darius the Mede was a Median. Darius the First, Hystaspes, was a Persian, which makes all the difference in the world. Now, Cambyses and Smerdis, pseudo-Smerdis, weren't that important for us because you don't see them in the Bible as far as the Achaemenid line of Persian kings goes. But Cyrus was. Remember, he's the one seen in Ezra chapter 1 who allows the exiles to return. And right behind him, we're going to find that Darius the First, Hystaspes, is very important. So after the death of pseudo-Smerdis, the kingdom begins to crumble among the Medes and the Persians because of all the bickering going on between these 7 families. And finally, one of the 7 extends himself to be the leader of all. That's Darius the First, Hystaspes, who comes to the throne in the year 521 BC. And it takes him 2 years until 519 to secure the kingdom to himself. Now this was the individual made famous, really he made himself famous, by the ancient inscription known as the Behistun inscription, Behistun, which was a huge monument, 500 feet high, 58 feet long in writing. It was trilingual, that means in 3 languages. It was done on the side of a mountain, right beside a major trade route between Baghdad, what today is Baghdad, Iraq, and Tehran, Iran. There was and still is a major route between Baghdad, one of the oldest cities of the world, Baghdad in Iraq, and Tehran, Iran. There was a spring right beside the foot of this mountain, so it only made sense that as you travel over this road, this would be where all of the travelers would stop, so you could pause here and get yourself a drink of water. So it wasn't just for some reason that didn't mean anything that Darius Hystaspes decided to make this great inscription there. He put it there because that's where people are going to stop. He immortalized himself, his campaigns, and so forth with this huge trilingual inscription. It was in Old Persian, it was in Babylonian, and it was in the Elamite language, which was of incalculable value to archaeologists since then, whenever we were finally able to decipher the Babylonian language. If you knew one, you could decipher the other two. Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite, which made it a trilingual inscription, comparable to, say, the Rosetta Stone that was found in Rosetta, Egypt, which also was a trilingual inscription, although, of course, it didn't have the same three languages. Now, do you remember back at the very beginning of Bib and Extra Bib Lit? We discussed, and we showed you pictures of the Behistun inscription. Well, that's one of the things that made him famous, or that he made himself famous by, because it's still over there today. The Behistun inscription, 500 feet up. Got some men to go up there on that rocky ledge and carve that thing in there, over 58 feet long, in this triple form of language. So he's famous for that. He also was famous for the intricate road system that he didn't build, but he rebuilt from the Babylonians, like the great one that went from Nineveh to Ecbatana. He also was famous for his trade relations, his concern for east-west trade relations, that according to the hieroglyphic inscriptions tell us he dug a canal between the Nile River and the Red Sea in order to be able to go from one to the other by boat rather than through the desert by land. We don't really have any remains of that in Egypt, but like I say, according to the hieroglyphic inscriptions, that's what we have. And he also, Darius I Hystaspes, was also well known for his extensive postal system that he established, that's set forth right in the Bible. I don't want to get into that because I'm going to deal with that in another class, but it's found right in the Bible, the extensive postal system. I don't know about 22 cents a letter, but it was an extensive postal system that he worked out. Now, let's get into a little history, put something up for you to see up front, and show you what all he did militarily. The first thing he does is he goes and attacks the Scythians. Now, we're way off the map over here with the Medes and the Persians. Now, if you remember what we've said about the Scythians before, they're a famous ancient people. They're not as famous as someone like Babylon. Everyone's heard of Babylon and Nineveh and Persia and things like this. A lot of people, maybe outside of the Bible, outside of studies in the Bible, have not heard of something like the Scythian people, but they're alluded to in the Old Testament. Their name is even used in the New, one place that I can think of, Colossians chapter 3, where Paul mentions the Scythian people as being an ancient group of people. But what you should remember thus far from what we've said about them is that they were confederate with the Babylonians and the Medes in sacking the city of Nineveh in 612 B.C., according to the first prophecy of Jonah in 782 B.C. and the final and culminative prophecy of Nahum in 650 B.C. But remember, according to Nahum chapter 2, we've got a confederation of nations. It happens to be the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians. The Scythians were a marauding band that traveled all over this part of the world, as you'll see where I'm going to point out where they ended up settling by this time. Because you've got to remember where Nineveh is. They're all the way down there with the Babylonians and Medes fighting against Nineveh. And so that's back 612 B.C. So we're a half a century past that in the time that we're talking right now. And there wasn't just one group of them. They were spread out, just a whole tribe of people spread out all over the place. So if Nineveh is, let's say, about right here, that means the Scythians were living in this region at the time. But in the time of Darius I, we're talking now 521, we're talking about them living just north of the Black Sea. They live all along the coast, the northern coast of the Black Sea. And so Darius wants to show them a thing or two in making them subject to the Persian rule. And just like Cyrus, remember Cyrus, we talked about before, had been all the way over here to Lydia and taking this kingdom away from some Greek people here. So Darius I, Hystaspes, comes through northern Asia Minor, through northern Turkey. He crosses the Bosporus Straits, or the Hellespont. He's able to take Thrace, which is the northeastern part of Greece. He actually goes up the coast, all the way up to the northern coast of the Black Sea, and in 2 campaigns, he's unsuccessful in both, in actually taking control of the Scythian people. There's only a small measure of victory that he gains. As you'll see, he was not the most productive king, militarily speaking, for the Medes and for the Persians. And so no sooner had he gotten through with his 2 unsuccessful attempts against the Scythians, and he gets back. Well, he doesn't even get back home. He gets back down into the eastern Cappadocia realm, and he has a minor revolt of the Greeks in Asia Minor, this region right here. We've already talked now about Cyrus conquering the Lydians, which means really this realm right here is controlled by the Persians. But now we have a minor revolt. And so Darius comes back from eastern Cappadocia to put this revolt down, and after being successful in putting this Ionian Greek revolt down, then it comes into his mind, Cyrus had thought of it before, but no one had dared do it that early. What about mainland Greece? None of the Persians had ever been over to mainland Greece, because here's where the Greek people are. These were simply Greek settlers, you see, that had come over to Asia Minor. That's not where Greece is. Those were just Greek settlers who had crossed the Aegean Sea to settle in Asia Minor in different places, such as this province known as Lydia, which Cyrus had taken. So what he decides to do is to cross over the Hellespont and go into mainland Greece and see what he's able to do. And what he really plans is a 2-fold battle. We're going to see 2 examples of this. So if you understand this, you'll understand the second one that we'll probably be able to get to tonight. One is by land, and one is by sea. Sounds like Paul Revere. Well, it really was. It was a 2-pronged attack. One, he was going to come southwardly out of Thrace, which had already been taken by the Persians. And then 2, he was going to sail directly across from Lydia, or from Sardis, or from Ephesus, that general region in Asia Minor, sail directly across, let's say, into the Athenian realm of Greece, and enter a naval battle with the Greeks. So you got several campaigns. The land campaign that comes from the north is fairly successful for a time. And in order to back that up and take the Greeks off the guard in the southern part of their country, then he sends out 600 ships, 40,000 men, and approximately half of both, the ships and the men, 300 ships, 20,000 men, were lost at a terrific storm at sea, which is reminiscent of the loss of Cambyses' land army in western Egypt. 50,000 men there, 300 war vessels, and 20,000 men lost in a storm at sea. But that doesn't stop Darius. He's still ready to bring his naval assault against the Greek people. And so in 490, he had the famous Battle of Marathon. Now here's Corinth. Athens would be, Corinth is right here at the isthmus that separates Achaia from the Peloponnese. Athens is about right here. And so Marathon is taking place out here. By the way, it was as he came around this cape right here at Mount Athos that he lost the 300 ships and 20,000 men. But Marathon is along this eastern coast here. So we have a terrific battle known as the Battle of Marathon that I had to write as many pages as possible on. So you can see, if you're understanding all that we're saying, that doesn't mean you're an authority on Medo-Persian history or something. I'm just summing all of this up in bare fashion, because we had to go into the battle plans and where they were and the various things like that. I'm just trying to familiarize you with names and places and people and things like that. We're not interested in Medo-Persian history except as it relates to the Bible. That's for the lost, unregenerate man out there to be a great scholar in the Babylonian tongue or something. That doesn't help us any. So the only reason we're studying this is as it relates to the Bible. So in the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians soundly defeat Darius I Hystaspes, even without the reinforcements that were being sent from Sparta. Now, Athens and Sparta, if you know anything about Greek history, were ancient enemies. Athens and Sparta, they were always fighting one another. But whenever it came to the motherland, and you got an attack by the Persians, and they had seen enough from what Darius I had done prior to this, and the somewhat successful northern land venture that he'd had, that whenever he did come in, he doesn't hold the language, the culture, their religion, their people, or anything sacred, but he demolishes all types of temples and shrines and so forth, then they're going to band together. Whether you've got people in Sparta or Athens are going to band together and fight. So here's Sparta. Sparta, made famous by references to people that are Spartan-like people, that's from the age of birth, they've led a military or regimented type life. Sparta is down here, and Sparta had planned to send reinforcements up here to Athens. They didn't come in time, but the Athenians didn't need them. In the naval battle of Marathon, the Athenian Greeks soundly defeated Darius I Hystaspes, which sent Darius back home. He didn't die there, he escaped. And just as he's leaving, you see, remember, after the Scythians up here, he's trying to get back home when he hears about this revolt over here in Lydia, and he has to go back and put those Greeks down. Now he's been defeated the Battle of Marathon, and he's returning home again, and he hears about the revolt in Egypt. Which, remember, Cambyses had been down to Egypt and had subjected the people there. So he soon heads down to Egypt, and in a small measure is able to quench the rebellion among the Egyptian subjects of the Persian Empire, and shortly after this he dies. Now that's extra biblical material that I thought you'd find interesting about Darius I. But he is found in the Word of God. He's seen in the book of Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah. But the major thing to remember is don't confuse Darius the Mede with, and he's not called Darius the First in the Bible. He's not called Darius the Great. He's not called Darius Hystaspes. He's only referred to as Darius. But he's not the same Darius as Darius the Mede. In Daniel chapter 5, verses 30 and 31, Daniel chapter 6 and verse 28, Daniel 9 and verse 1, Daniel 11 and verse 1, those are the places where Darius the Mede occurs by name. But Darius the First, the Great, Hystaspes, is an entirely different individual. Obviously, he's a Persian and not a Mede, and he's seen in other places in the Bible. Most notably, he's not found in the book of Daniel, which really helps us out a lot so that you don't confuse two men by the same name in the book. But you do find him in Ezra, chapters 4 to 6, the book of Haggai, the book of Zechariah. So with that in mind, let's go over to Ezra, and we'll work our way through the history of Darius I Hystaspes with regard to the exiles. Ezra chapters 4 through 6. Now Ezra is recounting the history of the first return of the exiles in the first 6 chapters of his book. It becomes autobiographical beginning with chapter 7 on through the end, chapter 10. We've already looked at chapter 1 of Ezra, which puts us back during the time of Cyrus, the first year of the reign of Cyrus. Now he starts way back Cyrus in 550, but the first year with regard to the conquering of Babylon. If Babylon fell in 539, that would be 538, which I believe, as we pointed out, would be the date of Ezra chapter 1, where you've got Cyrus allowing Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, Joshua, so forth, to return if that's their desire. Then in Ezra chapter 2, which we date 1 year later, 537, here you've got the people preparing to take themselves back. Chapter 3 and verse 1, in the 7th month of the year 537 BC. You can follow this on your chart as well. That's the best place to follow it. They're returning, and then notice on your chart. Well, let's just go back to your chart in case all of you... You slow me down now if I talk too fast. In case you're not following along in Ezra, you can see it here on your chart. Well, find 539 and you'll see the fall of Babylon. You see the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And go upwardly from that, and you see that's not the beginning of Cyrus's reign. He's reigned in Persia since 550, whenever he overthrew the Median king Astyages. But we're only speaking of him with regard to the conquering of Babylon. So Babylon falls in 539. Then you go down from that, and you see 538 begins the time of Zerubbabel and Joshua. Well, that's Ezra chapter 1. And then in between the date 538, and then you see the date 536, and out beside that it says temple started. Do you see that? In between that is Ezra chapter 2. They're making all these preparations, getting the people together and everything to go back. And of course it's going to take them several months to get back. Okay, now you see the date there, 536. We're covering a lot more than I thought we would cover. See, we're not even to the intertestamental period yet. We're really back into Old Testament Jewish history. But that way, either we won't have to cover it in the future, or you'll already know all about it whenever we review it in the future.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape.
We're covering a lot more than I thought we would cover. See, we're not even to the intertestamental period yet. We're really back into Old Testament Jewish history. But that way, either we won't have to cover it in the future, or you'll already know all about it whenever we review it in the future. See, as long as no one yells help, then I'm just assuming that we're all at the same level. Or either I can assume you're too embarrassed to yell help. But guess what? There's probably about 14 people around you who need help as well. Don't think you're the only one out there. Okay, where was I? The temple, 536. You see that on your chart? It's easy to follow along there. 536, the temple started. Well, you look over in Ezra 3 and verse 8. In the second year of their coming. Well, the first year is 537. The second year makes 536. Ezra 3 and verse 8. What do? They began to work on the temple. Look in verse 10. They laid the foundation of the temple. The foundation is the first thing that you do. You just lay your foundation. So that corresponds to the 536 on your chart. That's why, dear friends, we ordered these charts years ago so you could follow along a lot easier than you could otherwise. But we're still trying to get to Darius, remember. So then we get down into chapter 4. Let's start reading with verse 1. Ezra chapter 4. Because you can trace your chart at 536, and we're right smack dab in the middle of the reign of Cyrus. So what does this have to do with Darius? Well, I'm trying to make a point here. If you can follow me until I get to make the point, you have to make a lot of things that lead up to that concerning the temple. The temple started in 536. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, then they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers, and said unto them, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do. And we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, which brought us up hither. But Zerubbabel and Joshua, both of them by name on your chart. Zerubbabel is the deputy of the Persian king, and Joshua is the Jewish high priest. And the rest of the chief fathers of Israel said unto them, Ye have nothing to do with us to build an house unto our God, but we ourselves together will build unto the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, hath commanded us. Then the people of the land weaken the hands of the people of Judah, and trouble them in building. Now here's what we want, verse 5. And they hired counselors against them. That is, mediators between what's going on in Israel and the Persian court, to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, which would start in 538 when he gives the Ezra 1 decree, even until the reign of Darius. Well, you see, we're finally to the point I want to make, because Darius Hystaspes is the king under consideration now. Darius, king of Persia. Notice it doesn't call him the first, the great, or Hystaspes, only by the singular name Darius. When it calls him by that name, and it's found here in either the book of Ezra or Haggai or Zechariah, then you can know which Darius he's talking about. Because when we get over to Nehemiah's book, for instance, like Nehemiah, I believe it's the 12th chapter, we're going to be finding another king by the same name, but he's a different individual. And so from the beginning of Cyrus's reign with regard to the decree, we'd be dating it from 538. But it says in verse 5, to frustrate their purpose. Purpose of what? Building the temple. Well, they don't start on that until 536. So in other words, verse 5 would cover the years from 536 to 520 BC. From when we began on the temple during the reign of Cyrus down until, well, it says in this verse, the reign of Darius, but really until the second year of the reign of Darius. Darius begins reigning 521 after the 2-month reign of Pseudo-Smyrtus. So the second year would be 520. And if it says in the 5th verse that their purpose, the Jewish purpose in rebuilding the temple was frustrated until this time, that means that something great must be happening around 520 BC with regard to the temple. The last of the book sums this up. The last verse, verse 24 of chapter 4, Ezra 4:24. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. This is just summing up that 5th verse that we just looked at. So it ceased unto the second year of the reign. Well, there it says the second year. You see, I told you it was the second year. Back in verse 5, it didn't say it. So here we've got it in the Bible. You see, you've got it that way on your chart. So praise the Lord, we have a verse for it. So it ceased unto the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now, before we go on, maybe you want to go back and see this on your chart. We were at 536. In other words, we're going to have a 16-year period delay between whenever the foundation for the temple is laid, 536, then 16 years later, the temple is resumed, 520, and it's all completed there in the same year, or 4 years later, 516, as we'll see later on. But if you trace from the very top, 521, the beginning of the reign of Darius, and you come down on the chart to 520, then you see the temple being resumed, which puts it over into 1 year after the beginning of his reign. The next verse, Ezra 5 and verse 1, we're talking about the same year. We pick up the 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. It's under their prophesying. As we're going to see in a moment, we'll turn over to their books and we'll see where their prophecies are what encouraged the people. The people said in Haggai's day, it is not a time to build the temple. They're having all types of problems there with the renegade people left in the land. And as we'll see over in Haggai chapter 1, around verse 3 or 4, the people's response, as is crystallized in Haggai's writing, is the following: it's not a time to build the house of the Lord. That's why God has to send Haggai and Zechariah on the scene to begin prophesying to the people, exhorting and encouraging them to pick up where they had left off 16 years before in the work on the temple. And so sure enough, verses 1 and 2, you see them prophesying. We've still got Zerubbabel and Joshua on the scene. Again, that'll correspond with the chart, or with Ezra 5 and verse 2. The same deputy, the same civil, the same high priest, the same religious leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua. And then they have a little run-in with a governor, evidently some Persian governor by the name of Tatnai, seen in verse 3. And he says in verse 3, who hath commanded you to build this house and to make up this wall? And so they have to tell him, well, it's Cyrus. He's the one who told us to do this. And so in verse 6, you've got a letter that is sent back to King Darius to ask him to check and see on behalf of Tatnai the governor, the Persian governor, who's anti-Zerubbabel, Joshua, Haggai, Zechariah, and the rebuilding of the temple, to find out whether or not there is some extant record of Cyrus allowing the people to return and build the temple. Now, we know according to Ezra 1, why certainly, Cyrus was the one who allowed them to. And so look in chapter 6 and verse 1. This is at the request of Tatnai the governor. Then Darius the king, he's the same one. We said he's found in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book of Ezra. Then Darius the king made a decree, and he searched for, some record. Verse 2, and there was found at Ecbatana in the palace, that is in the province of the Medes, a roll, and therein was a record thus written. And here's the record. In the first year of Cyrus the king, the same Cyrus the king made a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. And here's what he said: let the house be builded, the place where they offered sacrifices, the foundations strongly laid, the height, so forth. Verse 4, let the expenses be given out of the king's house. So it's true to the statements of Zerubbabel and Joshua that Cyrus indeed had given them this permission. And so what Darius says is verse 7, let the work of this house of God alone. He's writing back now to Tatnai the governor. Let the governor of the Jews, Zerubbabel, and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. Moreover, I make a decree, what ye shall do to the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God, that of the king's goods, even of the tribute beyond the river, that formerly would come back into the treasuries of the king, Darius, forthwith expenses be given unto these men, that they be not hindered. How do you like that? God pays for your work from the finances of the heathen. Well, the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just. So here you got a true biblical historical example of that. The work of God, the building of God, and the prosperity of the people of God is all paid for by a pagan monarch, Darius Hystaspes. So you see, it's very important to study this individual. It goes on in verse 9 to mention all the various things that would be used in the sacrificial system that also would come out of the revenues of Darius. Verse 11, he said, I make a decree. Cyrus made one before, and here's mine, that whosoever shall alter this word, let timber be pulled down from his house. Being set up, let him be hanged thereon. And guess what? That happens to someone later on in the history of the Jews and their interaction with the Persians. And let his house be made a dunghill for this. And the God that hath caused his name to dwell there, destroy all kings and people that shall put to their hand to alter and destroy this house of God, which is at Jerusalem. I, Darius the first, the great, Hystaspes, not the Mede, have made a decree, let it be done with speed. And so Tatnai can't dare go against that. The elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered, verse 14, through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet, Zechariah, the son of Iddo, or the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, and they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. This house was finished on the 3rd day of the month Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. You subtract the 6 from the 521, counting that, and you come down to 516, which is when the temple was completed, 516. And then you've got all of this fortified again if you go over to the minor post-exilic prophets of Haggai and Zechariah. He's seen a couple of times in Haggai's book, a couple of times in Zechariah. I like to point out the places where the kings are seen. And from what I can remember, I'm always giving you all the places and the only places where they're seen. So all you got to do is make a note of it. I hope your Bible's not too holy to write in it. If it is, you can give it to me. I'll put it in my collection and write in it. Because that really helps you when you read your Bible. You don't have to have 14 charts, 18 tapes, and 27 books before you to find out, well, who is this fella here? Put a note out there, capital letters. This isn't Darius and me. This is the first, the great Hystaspes. Haggai, he gives, if I remember correctly, in these 2 chapters, 4 prophecies. They're all in the same year, the year 520 B.C. And interestingly enough, they're all dated according to the reign of Darius the first Hystaspes. So, and we pointed all this out in OTI. So there's no way you can understand chronologically Haggai if you don't know something about Darius. Because this very individual is dating it. I mean, if you were a prophet today, you'd say in such and such year of the administration of President Reagan. And that way, years down the road, someone would have to know, Reagan, was it 1 or 2-term president we're talking about? And which of the terms are you talking about? The second year of the first one, or the second year, which would make it the 6th year of the second term? That would make a lot of difference. Amen. So he says in verse 1, in the second year of Darius. Well, it begins in 521, so we're talking about 520. Very, very easy. The second year of Darius the king, the 6th month, the first day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua the son of Josedek, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, here's the verse I quoted earlier, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. The people really aren't too interested in building it. As you gather from reading the next few verses in Haggai 1, they want to build their own homes first. That's why God tells them in verse 6, you haven't taken care of spiritual religious matters first with your finances. Therefore, you've sown much and bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. This is a divine curse, in other words, dear friends, that was placed upon the people. When God's house, his holy place, was being built, and the people, I've even got a cartoon at home. I'll have to bring that sometime whenever I teach on Haggai. It's a remarkable cartoon. If I could remember enough of it, I would quote it to you, but I don't remember all of that. I've got the picture in my mind, but not all the words. But it has to do with these very words here about people who are covetous with their money and then wonder why God's striking them left and right in their life. Wonder why they just don't seem to have enough money or enough of this or whatever. He says, you clothe you, but you're not warm. You don't have enough clothes on. And he that earneth wages to put it into a bag with holes. So that's the divine curse on the people because they haven't taken into consideration the Lord's holy temple to begin with. They take care of the temple, God, you see, will take care of them. But they're so stingy, they're not going to help the Lord's work on the temple. They want to take care of themselves. So then we have to go down to verse 15. You see Darius again. Then he's dating his prophecy again, chapter 2 and verse 1. Let's see, he doesn't mention Darius' name, but he said the 7th month. 7th month of what? Well, he's talking about the reign of Darius. Verse 10 and then verse 20. So there from 1:1 to 2:1 to 2:10 to 2:20, you've got the 4 divisions of Haggai's little book, the 4 prophecies. It came all over a period of just a few months and a few days in the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, 520. Then over to Zechariah, chapter 1, verse 1. See, he's dating his prophecy according to the 2nd year of Darius. What did we read in Haggai 1:1? 2nd year of Darius. That means they're both starting 520. Doesn't Haggai start a little bit earlier, though? He starts 2 months earlier than Zechariah. He the 6th month, Zechariah the 8th month. But nevertheless, it's still the 2nd year of Darius, 520 B.C. And then the last date that Zechariah gives in his book, if I remember correctly, is over in chapter 7, probably the first verse, and that's where the King James translators would probably divide it, where I think he's talking about the year 518, which would be the 4th year of Darius. And he mentions his name there again. So that would sum up the places where Darius the first Hystaspes is seen. We've already covered his death. So that brings us to the next king. You don't have any questions there. We're coming all the way down to 586. You see, that passes way off the scene now, biblical history. We're way back 518, whenever we're talking about Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 1. So he's got a fairly good reign there. Well, I don't know if we have enough time to finish the next one. We'll get started on the next one and see how far we can go. And that's King Xerxes, Xerxes. There was a street named that back in Minneapolis, if you remember correctly. Did you know how to pronounce it then? Well, good. A lot of people don't know how to pronounce that street. Xer, how in the world do you pronounce that? Well, kind of like it sounds, Xerxes. Not exactly, but that's better than Ahasuerus, which is what we see the Hebrew phrase is in the Bible. Yes, he's known in the Hebrew by his name Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, which is the same king as King Xerxes. Xerxes is his Greek name. I forget what his Persian name is, but it's a lot closer to Ahasuerus. It's a long name, so I'm glad I forgot it, so you don't have to remember it. It's very, very similar to Ahasuerus, and as you transliterate that from the Persian over into the Hebrew, you end up with Ahasuerus. Okay, to begin with, this name, let me say this name is seen in 3 books of the Bible, Ahasuerus. Now, he's never seen as Xerxes in the Bible. We'll probably refer to him as Ahasuerus sometimes when we're talking about the biblical parallels, and then Xerxes outside of that, because that's what Herodotus refers to him by, as well as the other Greek historians, Xerxes. But I said he's seen, this name is seen in 3 books. It's seen in Esther, it's seen in Ezra, and it's seen in Daniel. So let's work in reverse order. The book of Daniel. Daniel, chapter 9, and verse 1. Now, what are we going to do with this? Daniel 9:1. The first year of Darius of the seed of the Medes, Darius the Mede, the son of Ahasuerus. Well, that means that Ahasuerus would come before Darius the Mede, but we've got him way after that. Well, it must refer to a different figure. A totally unknown figure. We don't know anything about this Ahasuerus, but what we can find here in this verse, and that is that he was the father of Darius the Mede, which means that he wasn't a Persian, he was a Mede. So in other words, this is not the Ahasuerus that the other portions of the Scriptures speak of, and it's not the Xerxes that the Greek historians speak of. That used to bother me years ago. Whenever I was first getting into all this chronology and getting into the book of Daniel, well, how could this be the same Ahasuerus as we see over in Esther's book, when they're scores of years apart from one another? Well, all it took was a little bit of looking and figuring and just thinking it couldn't be the same individual. And then I said, working in the reverse order, the book of Ezra, he's seen in Ezra, chapter 4 and verse 6, by the name Ahasuerus. They even try to give you some of the Persian name, I think, out in the margin. That verse is not that important. Again, it's talking about the thwarting of the purpose of the people, the exiles, and working on the temple. But, of course, as we all ought to know, he occupies the entire book of Esther. All 10 chapters of the book of Esther are filled with King Ahasuerus. Now, his kingdom was quite large geographically. According to the statement in the writings of Herodotus, paralleled with Esther 1:1, the extent of his kingdom went from Africa all the way to India, which was a huge kingdom. Esther 1:1. The first thing that Ahasuerus has to do, or Xerxes, whenever he comes on the scene in 486 BC, is put down a revolt in Egypt. We've got our second of 2 so far revolts in Egypt against the Persian control, and this is the first thing he has to do. The second thing he has to do is put down a revolt in Babylon. Now, do you remember what we said about the reception of Cyrus by the Babylonians whenever he took the city? He came in not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer, as a liberator to the people. And therefore, he didn't destroy their temples or anything. All of these great temples, such as the great temple of Marduk, was destroyed by Ahasuerus in this revolt of the Babylonians under the reign of Xerxes. That's when Babylon is really brought to the ground. There were only some minor demolition that went on prior to this. Obviously, something would have to be done whenever you've got someone like Belshazzar locked up in a citadel there in the end of Daniel chapter 5. So I'm not saying that nothing was done, but all of the great temples were not brought to the ground, such as the great temple of Marduk, until right after 486, whenever Ahasuerus comes to the throne. Now, according again to the book of Esther, chapter 1 and verse 2, his capital was in Shushan. We pointed that out to you on a map before. The Greeks referred to it as Susa, S-U-S-A. Daniel also was here in Daniel 8:2. So Shushan was a famous place, and this evidently was the capital the entire time for King Ahasuerus. Now, like I say, he's found throughout the book of Esther. Let's take a moment to look at a couple of, just some places where we see his name. And as I said, he's better known by the name Xerxes. As a matter of fact, your chart doesn't even give the name Ahasuerus. It only gives it to us as Xerxes. And that's important because that's the way he's known generally. It's just in the Hebrew Bible that he's known by a different name. Esther 1:1. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, and then parenthetically he said, this is Ahasuerus. He's kind of going to define who it is, geographically speaking, which is what we just have given you, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia. You know, Cush, way over in Africa. So that's a large extent for his kingdom, with the western boundary way over in Africa, and then the eastern boundary way past the eastern confines of the Medo-Persian Empire over into India. Over 127 provinces. That in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, there it tells us where he is, in the 3rd year of his reign, made a feast, a great feast unto all his princes and his servants. Now, whenever we come back to this subject next week, we're going to get into a look at what this feast was all about, because this is an interesting feast. And you know biblically what it's about. He has this feast, and remember he brings Vashti, his wife, before him, or he wants her to come, and she refuses to come, and he disposes her from being queen, and finally has to gather together some beautiful women from all over the kingdom, one of which was Esther, that he picks finally in chapter 2 as the queen to follow Vashti. But there are a lot of other things that go behind the biblical account of Esther chapters 1 and 2. The power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. So this was no small birthday party or something. He said the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of these 127 provinces of verse 1 were before him. And he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom, which Daniel chapter 12 speaks of. And the honor, Daniel chapter 11. And the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. I doubt we'll get into interpretation of that, but we'll get back to the feast, verse 5. When these days were expired, the king made a feast unto the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And then we've got in verse 10, on the 7th day of this week-long feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, then he got his 7 chamberlains before him and wanted to bring in, verse 11, Vashti the queen, to come in and show the people all of her beauty, but Vashti the queen didn't want to be a skin model before everyone, so she declined, which made the king very mad. He goes on to dispose her. And when he thinks about it later on, chapter 2 and verse 1, he's a little bit upset. Not really that he's done anything to Vashti, but that he doesn't have a queen anymore. It says that when he remembered the things that he had done to Vashti, what he had done to her and what was decreed against her, really the fact is that he didn't have a queen. That he said, verse 2, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. And so they go out, remember this story, and look for the virgins, and they're brought into the king and kept for a 12-month period until finally, down in verse 17, Esther the Jew. Esther the Jew is chosen as the great queen of the Persians. So we're going to stop there. We don't have enough time to get into a lot of the history of Xerxes, but we'll pick up there next week then. So it's taking us a while to get through the Medes and the Persians. But then you've got a number of kings that we have to deal with. We've still got several more to go after Xerxes or Ahasuerus. But after we get past the son of Ahasuerus, then we're getting down to kings that aren't nearly that important as these other ones have been that we've looked at before. None of which, with one exception, is even found in the Old Testament.